father-in-law was a United States Marshal back in the day. I sometimes joke that he used to hunt people for a living, but as he's corrected me on more than one occasion, it's more like he used to hunt the people who hunt people. The people hunter, if you will. And he's told me some pretty wild stories, especially around Christmas and Thanksgiving. The kind he only tells late at night, after a few bottles of beer, and when all those with more sensitive ears have retired upstairs to go to sleep. And most of them are war stories. Pretty great ones, make no mistake, but a lot of drive, drink, drug, shoot, arrest the bad guys, then how in time for pot, roast, and pie, as they say. But there was one story he told me that I haven't really been able to shake, and I'd like to share it with you. They'd been tracking this one fugitive for months, all across the country, when they suddenly got an eyewitness sighting of the guy at a Bible school out in rural Ohio. Under the assumption that he was living under a false identity, my father-in-law and his partner drove out to a place to talk to the school's principal. They seemed like real nice folks out there, a little naive but warm enough. And at first it seemed like they were doing their best to cooperate. But as time went by, it became more and more obvious that not only were the Bible school's staff and principal elaborately stonewalling them, but the place was much, much more than just a Bible school. The reason why an Ohio Bible school was so focused to shield a violent fugitive is that it was a cult. And I use the word cult very loosely, because I feel like that suggests a bunch of weird, naked rituals involving black magic, where maybe Tom Cruise makes an appearance or something, I don't know. That's an Eyes Wide Shut reference, you can't sue me for that. But what this place was just very close-knit. A Christian community that believed in absolute forgiveness and were willing to put themselves on the line for each other. They were smart enough not to make it obvious that they were aiding and abetting a criminal, but at the same time, it's no coincidence that their person of interest was never around whether the marshals stopped by. Things got more and more tense as time went by, too. My father-in-law and his partner kept on coming back, day after day, making it clear that they weren't going anywhere until they got a sit-down interview with the man they believed was their fugitive. Eventually, the school's principal snaps at the marshals and tells them to come back with a warrant, or not at all. Well, they went and got themselves a warrant, and then they came back with uniformed officers too, just in case the students put up any resistance. And according to my father-in-law, the school was set up as 4 buildings, with a field and meeting square in the center of them. Then, as the marshals and their uniformed accompaniment walk onto the property, the students start walking out of the building to give them death stares, including the principal. My father-in-law and the uniforms are walking slightly behind, and they see the kid before his partner does. So as soon as this 18 or 19-year-old kid starts to approach with a face like thunder, everyone starts telling him to stay where he is and to not come any closer. Seeing as this kid appears to be unarmed and looks to be about a buck and change soaking wet, they're all very casual about their commands. But as soon as he gets closer and closer, they start taking out their weapons and issuing the commands more seriously. But then the second they do, the kid just rushes them. He sprints towards my father-in-law's partner, but no one's shooting him because they don't want a scandal on their hands, and they're not really sure what to do in that moment. My father-in-law said that he could see the headlines already. Feds raid Bible school, 1 innocent student slain, and things of that nature. He knew pulling the trigger might kill his career before it had ever really started, so he chose not to. But he then spent the rest of his career wishing he had. I guess his partner ended up wishing that he shot the kid too, but he didn't. And instead, he got ready to receive his weak tackle so he could wrestle him to the dirt and put him in cuffs. But the kid didn't try and tackle him so much as he just walked up and hugged him with his big old smile on his face instead of a frown. The kid must have been much stronger than he looked, because when he clamped himself onto my father-in-law's partner, he started legitimately struggling to get him off. Now my father-in-law and the uniform start walking over to lend a hand, lowering their weapons, because the kid's got a screw loose, but he doesn't seem dangerous. But he was dangerous. They just didn't realize it until they saw what he had in his hands. My father-in-law's partner didn't see it because obviously the kid's hands were way around his back. But the others did, and when they saw it, they practically threw themselves backwards in an attempt to put whatever distance they could between my father-in-law's partner, the kid, and what the kid had in his hands, which, to their absolute shock and horror, was a goddamned hand grenade. And it must have only been a matter of seconds between the time they spotted the grenade and when it actually exploded. And when it did, it tore both men apart. And what followed was pure chaos. Everyone pointing guns at the students standing by the buildings, all the while backing up toward the way they came in. Because of the layout of the buildings at the school, they were in the perfect place for an ambush. After a bunch of backup arrived, the cops turned the whole place inside out, looking for weapons, drugs, anything they could use to start locking people up. But they didn't find their fugitive. And it took another year before the marshals wavered to track him down again. And when they did, he'd set himself up in yet another Bible school. Only this one was up in the middle of nowhere, Alaska. The guy was halfway into talking the students into defending him with their lives again when the marshals finally got their hands on him. In that time, their play was a lot smarter and a lot more subtle. My father-in-law got to question him at one point. It was little more than a favor granted after losing his partner in such a way. But when he did, he said he got chills from just maintaining eye contact with the guy. He said he was the most charming, personable individual he'd ever come across. The kind of guy that could sell sand to the Arabs and snow to the Eskimos. He said after talking to the guy for more than 10 to 15 minutes, he understood how he might be able to convince someone to blow themselves up, just to defend him. He said he felt that he was reading him, not like a book either, those take time. My father-in-law said the guy read him like a stop sign. One look and he knew all he needed to know. One look and he knew exactly how to talk to my father-in-law to get him to lower his defenses, so to speak. He said he never fell under that guy's spell or anything like that. He knew the fugitive was a master manipulator just from the interviews they'd conducted with the Bible school students, so he had it in the front of his mind the whole time that the guy was trying to win him over. But he also said that by the time 10 to 15 minutes had elapsed, he'd never felt so uncomfortable sitting in the same room as a suspect than he did that day. He'd sat in the same room as mass murderers, people who hurt children, people smugglers, all kinds of hardcore scumbags. But sitting across from those guys, you knew what they were, because they couldn't hide what they were. Whereas with the Bible school fugitive, it was like he could change his face depending on who he was talking to. My father-in-law said the guy ended up going to federal prison for his original crime, which I guess was some kind of financial fraud. I'm not sure of exactly what it was. But even combined with all the charges relating to him absconding from the law, his sentence didn't even top 15 years. My father-in-law knew the guy would probably get out of there before that too, and the idea of having someone like that back on the street was terrifying to him. He said he was the scariest son of a bitch he'd ever had the displeasure of coming across. And what scared him the most is that it was only a matter of time before he was back out there, getting up to his old tricks again. And when that happened, he had no doubt that people were going to die. I went to school with two guys who killed my sister's best friend. I know that's rough, but it's hard to explain what they were like. They didn't seem dangerous or strange, they were just normal, quiet mostly. They were on ROTC with her, so they spent a lot of time together. Nobody would have thought they were capable of what they did. One night after a party, they invited her to go mudding in one of their trucks. She'd always been the kind of person who said yes to those things, and she liked being out with friends and having a good time, and so she went with them. The details of what happened next are chilling. They drove out to a remote spot in the woods, somewhere the ground was soft and wet. They stopped the truck, and she got out to check the ground, probably to see if it was a good spot for the truck to drive through. And that's when one of them pulled a gun. He shot her in the back of the head, just like that. No warning, no argument, nothing. She never saw it coming. They didn't panic, they didn't run. They acted like it was just another part of the night, and they dug a shallow grave right there in the mud, put her body in it, and left. Then they drove to an IHOP and sat there, eating and talking, like nothing had happened. When they finished their meal, they went back to the grave. I guess they thought that it didn't look well enough hidden, so they covered her body up better, packed up, and left again. They might have gotten away with it, but they made a mistake. They tried to cross the Canadian border, and that's when they were caught. The police found evidence linking them to the murder, and it didn't take long for everything to come out. The truck, the gun, the grave. And at the trial, people wanted to know why. Why would they do something so terrible to someone they knew, someone who trusted them? One of them, The one who pulled the trigger gave an answer that still makes my skin crawl. He only said, "Morbid curiosity." And that was it. No remorse, no deeper reason, just those two words. I think about her sometimes, about how quickly everything changed for her. One minute she was out with people that she thought were friends, laughing and enjoying herself. The next, she was gone, just because someone wanted to see what it was like to kill. It doesn't make sense to me, and it never will. It all started with a simple act of kindness. There was an elderly man that I knew from a community group. He had lost his wife and was struggling financially. When I heard about his situation, I wanted to help. It wasn't much. I baked a cake for him while I was already cooking for my father. And at first he was grateful. He thanked me and was polite. But then things changed. He started waiting for me at the group meetings, always wanting my attention. He would interrupt my conversations and monopolize my time. And at first, I didn't think much of it. I tried to point him towards others who could help him, but he didn't seem interested in help, just in me. Then he started waiting outside after meetings, walking me to my car. I tried to spend more time with other people, hoping he'd get the hint. But one day, he showed up at my house. He said he wanted to drop off a thank you card. And after that, I noticed his car parked on the street more and more. He claimed he was walking in the area, but he would always find a reason to stop by. Everyone from the cops to his favorite musician to him. And I started avoiding him. If I saw his car, I'd drive away. I changed my routine, coming and going at different times. And at first, I didn't think of it as stalking. It was just annoying, but I didn't feel threatened. Other people brushed it off too. They said things like, "It's harmless," or "There's no fool like an old fool." Some even thought it was funny because he was twice my age, but it didn't feel funny to me. His behavior escalated. If I avoided him, he'd get angry and demand to know why. Leaders in our community group stepped in and warned him to leave me alone, but he became angry at them, and for a while, he backed off. He would still stare at me during meetings, and eventually it all started back up again. He began showing up everywhere I went. At the hospital with my daughter, he was there. He had stopped in St. Louis for lunch and stopped at the health food store for gasoline. At my sports games, he was there, and it felt like he was always watching me. I went to the police, but because he hadn't threatened me, they said there really wasn't much they could do. I stopped going to my regular group and joined another. And eventually, the group leaders warned him again, this time making it clear that he'd be reported for stalking if he contacted me. And for a year, I lived differently because of him. I changed my schedule, avoided certain places, and felt on edge all the time. This wasn't flattery. It wasn't harmless. It was obsessive, irrational, and scary. I wish I'd called it out sooner. I wish I'd told him from the beginning that his behavior was making me uncomfortable and needed to stop. Stalking isn't about affection or attraction. It's abuse. If someone's attention makes you feel unsafe or forces you to change your life, speak up. Name it for what it is, and take action quickly, unlike I did. I remember it being very late, and the rain had started coming down hard as I walked home. It was cold, the kind of rain that soaks through your clothes and chills you to the bone. My hood had barely helped me keep warm, and I wished I'd checked the weather before leaving. As I trudged along, a car slowed beside me, and the passenger window rolled down and the driver leaned over. He was offering me a ride. His voice was smooth, overly friendly, and full of insistence, and he kept saying how I'd catch a cold if I stayed out in the rain, and that he didn't mind helping me out. He looked older, maybe in his late 30s or 40s, but his smile just didn't reach his eyes, I guess. I shook my head, refusing politely but very firmly, and kept walking. The car crept along beside me and the man continued to talk. His tone shifted slightly, becoming more insistent, almost scolding me, and he sounded irritated, as though I was being unreasonable by not accepting his offer. But when I still refused, his friendliness vanished completely, and his voice turned cold and sharp, like he was full of anger. He made it clear that he thought that I was being stupid, and my heart was pounding as I turned down a side street, not daring to look back. And for a moment, I thought I heard the car hesitate before it sped off, splashing water as it went. I stood there, drenched and shaking before hurrying the rest of the way home, and at the time I brushed it off as just a strange, unsettling encounter. But a few days later, his face ended up on the news. The report said that he'd been arrested for assaulting a young woman, and according to that story, his method was to drive around while it was raining, looking for people walking alone. He would offer them a ride, and if they accepted, he'd lock the door and take control. And I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head. I thought about how close I'd come to accepting. If the rain had been just a little colder, or if I'd been more tired, I might have climbed into that car. And even now, the sound of rain hitting the pavement makes me uneasy. I'll never forget that feeling of his eyes on me, or the way his voice shifted from kindness to something much darker. Some people are kind, but he was a predator. Warning. This next story is deeply, deeply disturbing. 45 minutes away from midnight, on January 16th of 1936, the chaplain of New York's Sing Sing maximum security prison walked down a long, quiet corridor toward a stark, isolated cell. Inside, a condemned prisoner, bound for the electric chair, is being shaved. The guard gently rakes a razor blade over the final few patches of stubble on his scalp, then unceremoniously repeats the process on the prisoner's legs. When it's time, the prisoner is led from his cell to his execution chamber, the grim silence broken only by the whispered prayers of the prison chaplain. Inside the chamber, the dark silhouette of the iconic electric chair is suddenly illuminated as a guard flicks on the lights. The condemned is then guided to the chair, its leather straps tightened around their arms, legs, and chest. A moistened sponge is placed under a metal skull cap on their shaved head. Another electrode is secured to the bare patch of flesh on their freshly shaven leg. Once he's secured, the guard pulls back a pair of dark curtains, revealing an observation room filled with journalists, officials, and relatives of the condemned's departed victims. Their faces are a mix of steely resolve and silent dread. When asked if he has any last words, the condemned simply mutters, "I don't even know why I'm here." The guards, who by that point had spent almost a year ensuring his continual imprisonment, were somewhat underwhelmed by their charge's final, limp statement. One of them turns to the condemned's attorney, a man named James Dempsey. He is in possession of several pages of handwritten notes penned by his client in the final few hours before his execution. The guard asks Dempsey to reveal the contents of the notes, and Dempsey's reply is curt. "I will never show those letters to anyone," he says. "They're the most filthy, stomach-churning string of obscenities I have ever read." You see, the man in the electric chair is no ordinary prisoner. In fact, he is one of the most frighteningly deranged serial predators in American history. The media has dubbed him the Gray Man, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and the Brooklyn Vampire, but his real name is Albert Fish. Fish was born Hamilton Howard Fish in Washington, D.C. on May 19th of 1870. He was his parents' youngest child, conceived when his father was 74 years old, and was born into a family plagued by serious mental illness. His uncle suffered from mania. One of his brothers was confined to a state mental hospital, while his sister Annie was diagnosed with a mental affliction at a young age. 3 other relatives were eventually diagnosed with mental illnesses, while his own mother was said to suffer auditory and/or visual hallucinations. Tragically, on October 16th of 1875, Albert's father suffered a fatal heart attack while at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad station. Randall Fish was the glue which held the family together, so believing herself unfit to care for him, little Albert's mother sent him to D.C.'s St. John's Orphanage. Corporal punishment was rife at the orphanage, and it was here that a young Albert first began to develop an intense paraphilia associated with pain and suffering. Whenever a child erred or stepped out of line, one of the orphanage's staff would beat them mercilessly. Many adapted by becoming disturbingly institutionalized. Others lost their minds completely. Little Albert, on the other hand, adapted his psyche to the point that he enjoyed the pain induced by the corrective beatings. He lived that way for 5 long years, and then, following a successful course of psychiatric treatment, Albert's mother landed herself a job working for the federal government and was able to remove him from care. But in 1880, when she finally retrieved her now 10-year-old son, he was not how she remembered him. Growing up, Albert's mother called him Ham, while his friends affectionately referred to him as Ham and Eggs. But upon his release from St. John's Orphanage, he informed his mother that he wished to be known as Albert. And this seemingly innocuous declaration might seem insignificant at first, but it chilled little Albert's mother to her core. Her son had not picked the name Albert at random. In fact, it had belonged to a brother of his that had passed away during infancy. The desire to be named after his deceased sibling was probably the most profound manifestation of young Albert's deep-seated mental illness. But as he grew older, his symptoms would grow considerably more disturbing. In 1882, a 12-year-old Albert made friends with a local telegraph boy, who apparently was just as disturbed. After realizing Albert was easily manipulated, or perhaps due to a predilection of his own, the young boy introduced young Albert to the practice of drinking one's own urine and consuming one's own feces. It's believed such hideous acts are just the tip of the proverbial iceberg when it comes to their stomach-churning recreation. And over the years that followed, Albert sank deeper and deeper into depravity. By the time he was a teenager, Albert had taken to visiting public bathhouses, but instead of spending his time bathing, spritzing, or lounging in the steam room, Albert would linger in the changing area, watching as the other boys undressed. The ritual remained a lingering preoccupation for Albert, who spent most weekends haunting bathhouse changing areas and drawing suspicious stares. But over time, he began partaking in other hobbies, such as anonymously writing threatening or obscene correspondence to women whose names and addresses he acquired from newspaper ads. Albert continued living in D.C. until early 1890, when he made one of the most significant decisions of his entire life. He packed his bags, said goodbye to his mother and siblings, and then bought a one-way ticket to New York City. On his arrival in the Big Apple, a now 20-year-old Albert quickly exhausted his meager savings. He began engaging in prostitution and is believed to have groomed and molested several neighborhood children, mostly boys under the age of 6. He stayed in touch with his mother Ellen, who doted on her youngest child, but she was nevertheless concerned over her son's financial and matrimonial stagnation. So, in 1898, when Albert was in his late 20s, his mother arranged his marriage to 19-year-old Anna Hoffman, a friend's daughter, and they went on to have 6 children over the course of 5 years. But the financial strain forced Albert into criminality to make ends meet. It proved unsustainable, and in 1903, Albert was arrested, convicted of grand larceny, and incarcerated in Sing Sing prison. Upon his release, Fish was a changed man. His interest in family life dwindled, and he spent considerably more time pursuing acts of wanton debauchery. In one instance, he and a male lover attended a waxwork exhibition at a New York museum, and it was here that Fish became obsessed with mutilation, following an encounter with a waxworker who had bisection of a human penis. He became entranced with the biomechanical marvel that constitutes the human body. But unlike many of us, whose interests spark joy or constitute a positive intellectual pursuit, Albert's new fixation was far from healthy. Several years later, around the year 1910, Fish was working in Wilmington, Delaware, when he met 19-year-old Thomas Bedden. Having deduced that Bedden was a homosexual, Fish began pursuing him, but rather than fostering a romantic relationship, theirs was based in a deeply unsettling variety of violent sadomasochism. And once he'd fully gained his trust, Fish invited Bedden to join him in an old farmhouse, the implication being that they'd have a quiet, secluded spot in which to make love. But in meeting him there and allowing Fish to bind and restrain him, Thomas Bedden made the last and largest mistake of his life. Over the next 2 weeks, Albert Fish relentlessly tortured his hapless young captive, who apparently suffered from some variety of mental disability. Bedden was beaten, burned, flayed, and starved, before finally, Fish took a sharpened straight razor and castrated his screaming prisoner. "I shall never forget his scream, or the look he gave me," he later said. Having harbored an initial desire to murder Bedden once he was done with him, it appears that when it came time to do the deed, Fish had a sudden change of heart. Since it was high summer, he feared the stench of Bedden's decomposing corpse would draw attention to him during its transportation. But it's also possible that Fish simply felt merciful toward a young man he'd already subjected to unimaginable anguish. And so instead of killing him, Fish poured peroxide over the wound, where Bedden's genitals used to be, and then wrapped it in a Vaseline-covered handkerchief. Fish then slipped a $10 bill into Bedden's clothes, gave him one final kiss, and then slipped out of the barn and departed. "I took the first train I could to get back home," Fish later said, "but I never heard what became of that boy, and I never tried to find out." In January of 1917, Fish's wife finally grew tired of his bizarre and secretive lifestyle and divorced him before moving in with a local handyman. Fish later claimed that she took every possession the family owned, and while it's unclear if this is true, we know for certain that the divorce had a devastating effect on his psyche. He began to suffer the same auditory hallucinations his mother once had, and once found walking down a New York street wrapped in a carpet while loudly declaring himself an acolyte of John the Baptist. It was also around this time that Fish began driving steel needles into the flesh of his groin and abdomen. It's unclear if he considered this a form of religious flagellation, but following his eventual arrest, X-rays revealed that Fish had at least 29 needles embedded in his pelvic region. Fish would also hit himself repeatedly with a nail-studded paddle and inserted wool doused with lighter fluid into the cavities of his body before setting it to light. Following the mental breakdown caused by the failure of his marriage, Fish's mental health continued to slowly deteriorate. He became increasingly erratic and violent, until one day, while on a visit to Georgetown in the year 1919, Fish found himself gripped by the overwhelming urge to stab a complete stranger. The person he chose at random turned out to be an intellectually disabled boy. Fish walked up to him, drove a knife into his chest again and again and again, then simply walked back to his car and drove away. It marked the first time Fish had attacked someone with the intention of ending their life, and although the fate of his victim remains unknown, the incident proved a watershed moment in Albert's lifelong pursuit of depravity. On July 11th of 1921, Fish spotted 8-year-old Beatrice Keel playing alone at her parents' farm on Staten Island, New York. He approached the girl, offering her money in exchange for her help picking rhubarb. The girl accepted his invitation and was just about to depart with him before her mother caught wind of what was happening and chased Fish away. Incredibly,